Hello and welcome to Canguro English. My name is Christian and today is Monday, the best day of the week. Now, normally in these videos I answer various questions, but today I'm going to focus on just one question because I think that this one single question actually tells us a lot about English grammar and the difference between complex and simple sentences, and also about how languages work in general, about meaning and constructions. So let's read the question. The sentence down below is taken from the Cambridge Dictionary. It is given as an example of the word analogy. Even though I can get what the sentence says completely, I could not give meaning to the structure of the sentence after the comma, especially because of this structure, that a useful analogy is of the mind. I know that Chris will point out the reason of why it's hard to understand such a grammatical structure. So let's start by reading this example sentence from the dictionary. He was explaining that the mind has no form and is invisible, and that a useful analogy is of the mind being like the sky. Now, depending on what level of English you have, depending on, the strength of your grammar, this sentence might seem kind of easy, or it might seem very complicated and intimidating. But I'm actually going to show you that the sentence isn't really that scary. It's just using a really important part of English grammar called ellipsis. And ellipsis is designed to eliminate repetition, because that constant repetition is what makes people who are learning languages at the beginning, it can make their sentences kind of really boring. Right? They're repeating the same thing a lot, which is perfectly normal. But by using some simple techniques, we can kind of eliminate that repetition, right? So let me give you an example. So let's have a look at the first part of the sentence. He was explaining that the mind has no form and is invisible. Right? So let's have a look at this little joining word here, and. This and is like kind of glue, which is gluing together these two parts of the sentence. This part and this part. Now, what is the and actually doing? Well, it's gluing this is invisible, it's gluing this onto all of this first part of the sentence, right? So we don't need to repeat it. That's what the rule of ellipsis is. If we have two parallel structures that are identical, we can eliminate that second copy of the parallel structure. We can eliminate any of that repetitive stuff that's identical. So maybe if you're a beginner, you would make this sentence, right? You would say, he was explaining that the mind has no form. Full stop. Then you make a new sentence. He was explaining that the mind is invisible. Full stop. Next sentence. Repeating, right? But what we can do is we can eliminate the repetition by using our and. Okay? By using our and to eliminate that parallel structure. He was explaining that the mind has no form and is invisible. And we're doing the same thing with the second part here. And that, so have a look, right? Have a look. This and that is eliminating the repetition of all of this, right? It's eliminating the repetition of he was explaining that the mind has no form and is invisible, and that... So by using this, we don't need to repeat that he was explaining, and we don't need to repeat the mind. Okay, so now let's look at the second part of this sentence. A useful analogy is of the mind being like the sky. Now, do you notice anything kind of weird or strange about this sentence? Just have a look and have a think if there's anything kind of unusual about any part of this. Being. Why is this a gerund? Is it because it's the continuous or the progressive tense? No, because we're missing our auxiliary verb. So it's not that. It must be something else. Now, maybe you're thinking, if you're a very good student, maybe you're thinking that the reason that this is a gerund is because we have here a preposition of. And the rule in English is that if you have a preposition, any verbs after the preposition must be in the gerund. So for example, after all phrasal verbs, which all contain prepositions, any verbs after phrasal verbs must be in the gerund. So maybe that's the answer. Not really, because this of is not actually necessary. It's because analogy and of, they collocate, they sound natural together. But it's not actually necessary. We could say a useful analogy is the mind being like the sky. So it's something else. Do you know what it is? It's because this is now no longer a verb. This is actually a noun. And how do we know that? Because in this position, we are expecting a noun. Just like in the first part of the sentence. Look. The mind has no form. Let's just break that out. The mind has no form. We have the same thing. Look. A useful analogy is of being there like the sky. Subject, verb, object, noun, form. So actually all of this, the mind being like the sky, all of this second part of the sentence is the object of this verb, is. And we could actually substitute this whole part of the sentence, we could substitute this for any noun. I could say that a useful analogy is of pizza. A useful analogy is of happiness. So any noun we could put in this position. But here we're not just putting a noun, we're putting a whole noun phrase. And that's one of the kind of weird parts of English grammar, is that if we take a verb and we add ing on the end, being, swimming, jumping, now it's not a verb anymore. It looks like a verb, it smells like a verb, but it's not a verb, it's a noun. And that brings me to the kind of final part of the very cool thing that this sentence tells us about. Okay? It tells us that the structure gives the meaning. We can't just look at this word and analyze it. Is that a noun? Is that a verb? Well, I don't know. I don't know until I look at all of it together. That's why it's really important to see language as constructions, and the constructions give meaning. For example, I can substitute these real English words for words that I invented. Look, A useful analogy is of the blixes tumping like novs. Now, you don't know what these three words mean. I just invented these three words, blixes and tumping and novs. But because of this construction, you know what they should mean. You have an idea of their function, of their action, of the way that I'm using comparisons, and the way that this one must be a noun for something concrete. The structure, we have to analyze it as a whole structure. Okay, now let's move on to the final part. Let's reconstruct this sentence. Okay, now remember that I told you that in English, when we have parallel structures, we can eliminate any copies, any repetitions, to make our sentences more concise, to make communication faster and with less complexity. Okay? So actually, this original sentence, we can eliminate more things. We're not finished. Look at this. He was explaining that the mind has no form and is invisible, and that. Look at this parallel structure. That means that we don't need the that. He was explaining that the mind has no form and is invisible, and a useful analogy is of the mind being like the sky. Again, you can see here this parallel structure, so we don't need that either. He was explaining that the mind has no form and is invisible, and a useful analogy is of being like the sky. So now we have eliminated every single point of repetition in this sentence. And we have this really concise, really beautiful, and really simple kind of sentence which tells a story, right? It tells that you aren't, a beginner of language, that you understand that, the repetition is kind of boring for the listener. You understand that making these complex sentences isn't really that complex. The best way to learn to make these longer, complex sentences with clauses is to just make lots of long, complex sentences with clauses. And also to make a lot of mistakes, because mistakes are learning. So if you want to get better at it, you should do it a lot. I hope that this helped to explain what ellipsis is, some interesting things about English grammar, and the meanings, the deep meanings inside constructions. I'm Christian, this is Canguro English. I'll see you in class.